On the Metro, culture and arts take center stage.
I want this emotion behind it. I want this tone and whatever. So the whole thing that you're crafting.
When you go to a show, that's when you realize you're not alone, that you're suddenly with all these people that you resonate with, that you relate to.
It can be a real grassroots presentation. There's a long history within Detroit.
Welcome back to the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham. This Wednesday marks 60 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, enshrining equal voting rights for Black people in this country. To put it another way, on this day, 60 years ago, I would not have been able to vote. My mom tells the story of the first time her mother, my grandmother, was allowed to vote, and she went with her in person. My mom was no older than 6 years old. It's not ancient history. I've heard these stories from the folks who've lived them firsthand. A piece of history from Selma, Alabama is moving permanently to Metro Detroit. The Henry Ford in Dearborn, which includes the Museum of Innovation and Greenfield Village, acquired the Jackson House in 2023. It was owned by Dr. Sullivan Jackson and Mrs. Ritchie Jean Sherrod Jackson. On Wednesday this week, the Detroit Public Library is hosting a discussion on the Voting Rights Act and the Jackson House. It's at the main branch of the Detroit Public Library at 6 p.m. and will feature Henry Ford's Curator of Black History, Amber Mitchell. Amber joins us right now to talk a little bit more about the Jackson House in 60 years since the Voting Rights Act. Amber, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks for having me, Tia.
Of course. So jumping in, what makes the Jackson House such an important landmark in U.S. history?
Absolutely. So the Jackson home, in addition to being the home of 3 generations of Black dentists and teachers, was also the organizing home for Dr. Martin Luther King and his crew of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at the height of the voting rights movement in 1965. And the reason that he lived in this home between January and June of 65 was because he was close personal friends with Dr. and Mrs. Jackson. And so in this home, during this time period, they not only obviously planned aspects of what will become the Selma to Montgomery Selma to Montgomery March in late March of 1965, they also gave them a place to rest and put their heads down to be able to move on to the next battles that would need to be fought, all while, of course, having a young child in the home at the same time. And I just also want to acknowledge the fact that this was very dangerous at this time. You know, Dr. King and other members of SCLC, as well as other organizing groups who were down in Selma, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Dallas County Voters League, were not under any myths about how dangerous this work was and how there was constant threats being conducted against them and as well as members of this family. So this story is could not be more important than it is right now.
And you spoke briefly about the danger. It was dangerous to be in that place, in that space at that moment. Can you talk about the significance of third spaces for this particular civil rights movement that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
Absolutely. I mean, voting is our most important job as American citizens, and having the ability to be able to choose your representation both at the local, state, and federal level is something that's very important. And no one would know that better than African Americans during this particular time period where their vote was not accessible to them, even though on paper they were supposed to be able to have the vote. And so to be able to say, hey, I want to have myself represented by people who look like me, who understand my struggle, wouldn't necessarily have been taken too kindly by the white supremacist establishment in these areas, especially along the Black Belt of Alabama. And so the Jacksons, like many others, were under significant risks of losing income, losing jobs, losing places to live, as well as ultimately possibly losing their life. There are 4 martyrs of the voting rights movement, and we can't forget, of course, one who is from Detroit, Miss Viola Liuzzo, who lost her life during this movement.
And Amber, just speaking on that, just thinking about what you're saying and the danger, I just instantly, my mind went back to enslavement and the Underground Railroad and how those spaces as well constantly under attack, constantly in fear of it being found out and horrible things happening within those spaces. So I just think about how it just kind of continued on, especially through to the civil rights movement. But how did the Selma to Montgomery marches lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965? What events led up to it during the marches?
Absolutely. So the marches really are a culmination of a number of different things that start even years before 1965 with the development of the Dallas County Voters League. And these are the folks who are on the ground doing the organizing in Selma, who really, they live there. They know the people there, and they are known within this community. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference comes in later in 1963, and they're working a lot with working class people, poor folks, and of course young people during this time. Folks are getting arrested constantly. There's all kinds of rules and laws that are coming up unjustly that are stopping people from being able to exercise their right to assemble. And then, of course, Dr. King and SCLC come into town in January of 65, and really Dr. King's arrival allows for there to be a national attention on this local movement because wherever Dr. King went at this time period, the news and the media were coming at the same time. And so before what we now call Bloody Sunday, there were a number of different demonstrations, but really it's not until March 7th of 1965 where we get these absolutely disturbing images of, leaders of SCLC and SNCC, namely Reverend Hosea Williams and former Congressman John Lewis, who are parading across the infamous Edmund Pettus Bridge, leading a crew of peaceful protesters to march towards Selma. And they are met with absolute violence on behalf of the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, as well as the Alabama State Troopers. And it's these images that bring the world to Selma, that bring all of America to Selma, and lead up to what ultimately would become the Selma to Montgomery March, the successful march that happens between the 21st and 25th of 65. And really, it is this mass amount of people power, community power, that is a real game changer when it comes to this particular moment. And bringing in all kinds of folks, especially clergy from all over the country of all different kinds of ethnic and faith backgrounds to stand with the communities in Selma and Dallas County, and ultimately all African Americans across the South and the North.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Amber Mitchell, curator of Black History at the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. The village is getting a new building in 2026 that was an important part of civil rights history in the U.S., the Jackson House. This Wednesday, Amber will lead a presentation about the Jackson House to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act being signed into law. The event will be at the Detroit Public Library's main branch. Now, Amber, let's talk about the house, a little bit more about the house itself. Can you describe it and how big was it? What did it look like? Was it 2 stories? Was it brick home? Can you give us a little bit of detail?
Absolutely. It is a beautiful Southern bungalow, an arts and crafts style Southern bungalow. It's built in 1919 and designed by Wallace Rayfield, who himself is his own historic person in that he is the second licensed Black architect in the United States, which during his time period, there are not a lot of us. I just mentioned he's the second. And so he designs this very beautiful home that had a number of additions added onto it. So what people will see when they come to visit us starting next summer of 2026, well, they will see a home that had been renovated and had been touched up well up until 1965. It's very colorful. On the outside, it's this beautiful salmony pink color, which I think for a lot of us Michiganders, we're like, pink? What does that mean?
Exactly.
Well, it's a Southern house, y'all, so we love Southern colors. It has very much a living memory for a lot of people, especially those who have a living memory of the 1960s. So definitely definitely lots of different textures and colors and just really cool things that are inside this home. If you're familiar with Greenfield Village, this will be our first house with electricity in it.
Wow.
So it will have a television. It will have a radio. For Christmas, it'll be decorated with that beautiful aluminum trees, aluminum Christmas trees. It'll have colors on the outside of it, of course, around Christmas time. So, this home will allow us to tell a different kind of story than we get in Greenfield Village generally, really a much more modern story, on top of it being modern for a number of reasons, not just the time period of the home and the way that it's interpreted, but also a story that is insanely relevant right now, and that is American access to the vote, especially for African Americans.
Amber, just being someone, I graduated from Henry Ford Academy, which is inside Greenfield Village in Henry Ford Museum. So I'm very, very familiar with Greenfield Village and the offerings there. And to hear that and to think about just a modern home that you can walk into, flick lights on, or just see modern things happen, is going to be such a game changer for the experience at Greenfield Village. For those who aren't familiar with Greenfield Village, is very, 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 very historical period making type of space for you. So I cannot wait to see that in the summer of 2026. Now, let's talk a little bit about what actually goes into moving an entire home. It sounds like quite an undertaking.
It absolutely was, and still is. So when we acquired the home in 2023 from Miss Joanna Jackson, that 4-year-old during the height of the movement in 65, now definitely not 4, and the only living relative left to own the home, we were very intentional about ensuring that we maintain the integrity of the house. In Henry Ford's day, the way that he dismantled homes and brought them into Greenfield Village was basically piece by piece. Yeah. It was a controlled demolition. We did not want to do that because we wanted to maintain, again, the feel of this home, because when you step into it, it feels comforting. It feels like a grandmother's house in many ways. And so essentially what we did was remove all of the 7,000 plus artifacts that were inside of the home, shipped them up to Michigan first, took off the roof, took off the front porch, removed some historically relevant pieces of the home, shored it up basically in 2 boxes and cut it in half and drove the home up in 2 pieces. And so it has been replaced here in Greenfield Village in our Porches and Parlors district since late fall of last year, where it is currently being renovated to its historical accuracy. And a lot of those artifacts that I mentioned, those 7,000 plus artifacts, including photos, have been helping us to understand not only just life in the house, but how did this home look during this period? If you think about how many times you maybe have redone your own home, or maybe remodeled your kitchen or repainted a bedroom, think about how much you have done to your own spaces. And this home, because it was lived in for its entire life in Selma, had the same events happen to it. So we literally have been using both family records, photos, and literally peeling back the layers of this home to see how these things existed and how the space existed. And surprisingly, a big help to us, which is going to sound weird, has been nicotine. Yeah. So if you think about how people smoked in the 1960s, and a lot of those items in those spaces were up on walls, were then outlined in nicotine. So once we pulled off drywall and got back to those original layers of the home, we were able to see exactly where artifacts that came in our collection were in the home at that period of time. So it's really cool. It's a really awesome example of historical detective work. And
Amber, really quickly, briefly, why not leave the Jackson house in Selma, Alabama, where it took place, where the history is, Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, we were approached by Miss Joanna herself. She, as I mentioned, she is the only child of Dr. and Mrs. Jackson. And she was operating the home as a museum herself for the last 10 years before she approached us in 2022. And we worked with her very closely about looking for a space to steward her family story, knowing that time is the only thing that is guaranteed to all of us, as far as making sure that there is a place that can not only just take parts of her family story, but could take the entire thing. And so this wasn't an acquisition that we went into lightly, and we're continuing to do close work with the people of Selma and continuing to engage at that level there. But when, we always have to think about, well, what is the best thing to ensure that this story remains into perpetuity, is continued to be protected, and the Henry Ford is thankful to be able to have not only just been asked, but also to have the ability to do that work. We have over 85 historic structures and businesses out in Greenfield Village. If there's anything we know how to do, it's preserve a home, it's preserve a business, and also to maintain its historical integrity.
Facts. Going there once again and just being able to experience history firsthand with the buildings or just live demonstrations was very, very crucial to my love of history. But Amber, just speaking of the Jackson House, a really exciting addition to Greenfield Village we've already spoken about. But those buildings that are there tell the story of invention and innovation and kind of through the eyes and the lens of Henry Ford. But the Jackson House is telling a completely different part of U.S. history, the part that we can compare to Rosa Parks' bust being there at the museum. So does this signal a change or at least an expansion of the kinds of histories that the Henry Ford Museum are trying to tell and preserve?
Absolutely. This home represents an expansion, I will say, to use your terminology, an expansion of things that we're already doing and have been doing. The Henry Ford in 2001 acquired the Rosa Parks bust, and it has remained at the center of our With Liberty and Justice for All exhibition. We've done a number of other smaller collections, but I think ultimately what the Henry Ford does best is showing innovation at all stages, including social, which this would count as. And I think what we do best at the same time is also tell the stories of everyday people. You know, in Miss Ritchie Jean's words, she wrote an amazing book that we're using to help inform our interpretation called The House by the Side of the Road. And in this book, she mentions the fact that we all can't be a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but what we can do is make a difference in the ways in which our community interacts on a daily basis. And I think for the majority of the spaces and places and the stories that we tell at Greenfield Village and at the Henry Ford generally, they represent everyday people. And that's what this home represents. Everyday people deciding that they had had enough and really standing in the gap for all of us to have what we have today.
Amber, oh man. And just this year, the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Black Wall Street was, and where the, of course, 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre happened, was made a National Historic Landmark. And just last week, as we spoke with two women who are working to preserve the historic Idlewild community in northern Michigan, it brings up the question, are Black histories finally reaching a point where they're included in the mainstream version of American history?
Absolutely. Though I think we're at a point where we also have to fight to maintain our place, right? Maintain our place to share these stories. And I think, you know, I'd be remiss not to discuss and not to bring up the fact that African Americans have always included our own stories. We wouldn't have a place like the National Museum of African American History. We wouldn't have a place like the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. We've always been at the forefront of preserving our own stories. And so it's just the rest of the country that's really catching up, you know, in many ways. And like you, as somebody who also went to Henry Ford Academy as a high school student and really was immersed in preserving ourselves, it's really an awesome thing to be able to see our own community as African Americans represented here in that way, and to also be a part of preserving it. I would also just want to make sure that we also acknowledge the fact that there are so many other stories. For every Jackson home that is preserved, there are so many others that aren't. And so it's important for us to be our own best advocates as community members, as budding historians, as people who care about our history as African Americans or other groups. We should always be looking to preserve our own histories.
Amber Mitchell is a curator of Black history at the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. If you want to join this discussion, Amber will be part of a discussion about the Jackson House and the Selma to Montgomery Marches at the Detroit Public Library main branch this Wednesday. It will be the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act being signed into law. Amber, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro and really explaining to us 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, the importance of it, especially socially.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation. I hope to see people out on Wednesday.
This is the Metro, and WDET's listener survey is now open, and your feedback helps shape the future of Detroit Public Radio. It's quick, it's anonymous, and lets us know what you love, what you like more of, and where we can improve. So complete that survey, and you'll be entered for a chance to win a custom WDET prize pack. Visit WDET.org/survey. Coming up, science is starting to reveal what effects screen time on tablets and phones can have on kids. We'll hear from a pediatrician and a professor. That's coming up next right here on The Metro.